My son laughed when the old man walked into my wedding, a quiet, brittle sound meant to hide his discomfort. He didn't know the man carried decades of grief in his eyes, or that the truth he brought with him would crack our family open. By the end of the night, the space between them held a secret none of us could ignore. The story follows Claire, a mother who has spent her life protecting her son from the shadows of his childhood. Newly remarried, she hopes her wedding day will be a fresh beginning, a quiet moment of happiness after years of carrying disappointments. But when her husband Daniel arrives at the ceremony and her son reacts with mockery, old wounds stir beneath the polished surface of celebration. Claire watches the two men navigate polite small talk, unaware that their histories are already intertwined in ways she never imagined. What begins as a simple misunderstanding grows into a reckoning shaped by loss, truth, and the fragile attempt to rebuild something almost forgotten. The music had just begun to settle into the soft, familiar hum that fills a chapel before a wedding when Daniel stepped through the doorway. The light behind him framed his outline in a pale glow, catching on the lines of his face, lines shaped by years rather than age. For a moment, all I saw was the man I chose, the man who steadied my life after so many storms. But then Jonah leaned toward his wife and whispered something under his breath. She tried to hide her grin behind her hand, but the sound slipped out anyway, a small, amused huff. Jonah's shoulders shook once in a quiet laugh. Daniel heard it. He didn't turn. He didn't frown. He just offered a tired, practiced smile, the kind worn by someone who learned long ago how to absorb small cruelties without letting them spill. I felt the flinch he tried to hide. The guests shifted politely as Daniel found his place near the front, nodding to familiar faces with that gentle, unassuming composure he always carried. But Jonah watched him with a furrowed brow, his earlier amusement already hardening into something else, discomfort, maybe, or irritation he didn't care to disguise. My son was not cruel, not intentionally, but he had learned to judge quickly, especially where I was concerned. He saw Daniel's quietness and mistook it for weakness. Saw the stoop in his shoulders and assumed fragility. Saw the age lines and assumed irrelevance. The music swelled, politely encouraging everyone to take their seats. Jonah tugged lightly at his wife's hand, guiding her toward their row, but his eyes never left Daniel. I could feel the tension radiating from him like heat off a stovetop. When I reached the front and took my place, Daniel turned toward me with a softness that steadied my breath. Yet even as he smiled at me, something about his gaze flickered past my shoulder, drawn again to Jonah, and then away just as quickly, as though the sight of him burned. His ceremony began. Words filled the air, kind words, warm words, but they felt strangely muffled, as if spoken underwater. The chapel seemed to shrink around us, tightening with each verse recited. Jonah shifted in his seat, restless. He crossed his arms, uncrossed them. He leaned toward his wife again, and though I couldn't hear him this time, I saw the small shake of her head. A gentle reminder to behave. Jonah's irritation sharpened at the edges. And Daniel stood at my side with hands clasped, shoulders pulled slightly inward, as though he were bracing against a wind no one else could feel. He avoided looking directly at Jonah. Not once. Whenever his gaze drifted toward the guests, he skirted around my son, as though Jonah were a bright light he couldn't bear to face. His eyes softened every time they neared him, softened into something I didn't recognize. Not fear, not guilt, not grief exactly, but something close, something painful, something old. As the vows continued, I stole a glance at Jonah. He wasn't smiling anymore. His jaw had tightened. His eyes narrowed in a way I hadn't seen since his teenage years, when anger lived right beneath his skin, sharp and ready. His wife gently rested her hand on his knee. He didn't look at her. His gaze stayed locked on Daniel, studying him as though searching for a fault he needed confirmed. The chapel lights flickered slightly, catching in the stained glass windows and casting soft colors across Daniel's face. He looked peaceful from a distance. But up close from where I stood, I saw the truth. His hand trembled. Just barely. Just enough for me to notice. Enough to make something inside me twist. Why would Jonah's laughter shake him so deeply? Why would my son's presence pull him into himself like that? The air grew heavier with each passing moment, settling around us like damp wool. The scent of lilies filled the room, sweet, almost cloying, mixing with the faint creak of the wooden pews as guests shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't the kind of tension that announces itself loudly. It was quieter, a slow pressure building beneath the floorboards, a whisper beneath every spoken vow. When the minister reached the blessing, Daniel's eyes drifted again, almost involuntarily, toward Jonah. And Jonah, as if sensing it, lifted his gaze at the exact same moment. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat. Jonah's expression hardened, cool and assessing. Daniel's softened even further, a quiet, aching look that unsettled me. It wasn't a look a man gives his stepson. It wasn't pity. It wasn't annoyance. It was something deeper, something more tender, something that looked painfully like recognition. Daniel blinked, breaking the connection quickly, as though afraid he had stared too long. Jonah leaned back in his seat, brows knitting in confusion. He looked almost unsettled, as if something in Daniel's gaze had reached a place Jonah had kept sealed. I watched the two of them, feeling the ceremony move around us in careful, rehearsed motions while something far more important unfolded silently between them. The truth sat in the air, unspoken, unseen, but heavy enough to bend the light. When the minister asked Daniel to repeat his vows, he hesitated for the briefest second, not because he doubted us, but because his eyes flicked once more toward Jonah, softening in that same inexplicable way. And then he spoke. His words were steady, gentle, spoken with the sincerity I had fallen in love with. But they carried a tremor beneath them, not of nerves, but of weight. The kind of weight a man carries when facing a past he never meant to confront. When the chapel erupted in quiet applause moments later, Jonah didn't clap. He sat still, jaw clenched, staring at Daniel as though trying to unravel a thread he didn't know he was holding. Daniel didn't meet his gaze again. Not once. As we turned to face the guests, the air felt thick enough to gather in my hands. Jonah finally rose, helping his wife up as the crowd shifted. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Part confusion, part irritation, part something heavier. His wife whispered to him, but he only shook his head, eyes drifting back to Daniel. A strange silence stretched across the space between them. A silence that felt less like distance and more like a doorway. One I didn't yet understand. But Daniel did. I could see it in the way he kept his eyes lowered, hands clasped tightly. I could see it in the way Jonah's stare lingered, searching for something he didn't yet have the words for. And as the ceremony moved forward, a question pressed itself into my chest, quiet but relentless. What truth lies beneath Daniel's softened gaze, and why does it tremble every time it finds my son? The reception hall felt softer than the chapel had. Warm lights, low music, the clatter of plates waiting to be touched. Outside, the sky was sinking into a muted evening, the kind that makes everything look gentler than it is. But inside, the quiet carried a different weight. Daniel stood near the window, half-shadowed, watching Jonah across the room. The expression on his face wasn't simple. It wasn't admiration or dislike. It was something layered, something older than this day, this wedding, this moment. Longing, maybe, or grief wrapped so tightly it forgot how to breathe. Jonah didn't see the softness in it. He caught only the gaze, brief, heavy, and stiffened immediately. His mouth tightened. His shoulders went rigid beneath his dress shirt. To him, that look meant judgment, disapproval, a reminder that the man his mother married was a stranger he hadn't chosen to trust. I moved through the small clusters of guests, smiling, nodding, accepting congratulations that felt light compared to the current beneath my ribs. Every few steps, I glanced toward the two of them. Jonah tense at the table with his hands clasped, Daniel standing too still near the window, eyes lowered whenever Jonah accidentally glanced his way. It should have been an easy evening, a calm one, a celebration. Instead, the air felt fragile, like the surface of a pond thin enough to crack under a whispered truth. Daniel reached for a glass of water and held it too carefully, as though he feared it might tremble from his hand. Jonah saw this too, and the irritation on his face deepened. He turned away, murmuring something to his wife, who tried, gently, unsuccessfully, to soothe his expression. I moved closer, hoping to ease the distance somehow. "The food will be ready soon," I offered, reaching for a thread of normalcy. Daniel only nodded. His smile was polite, but he had already retreated behind it. Behind something quiet and sorrowful. Jonah's wife, Emily, appeared at my side with a small, uncertain smile. There was nervousness in the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. She hesitated, glancing toward Daniel before leaning in slightly. "Has he," she whispered, "always been this strange?" I blinked, my breath catching. Strange wasn't the word I would have used. Gentle, thoughtful, reserved, yes. But strange? The question lodged uncomfortably in my chest. Emily softened her tone. "He keeps staring at Jonah. It's making him tense." I looked at my son. Jonah sat stiffly, jaw clenched, fingers tapping once against the table before he forced them still. His eyes flicked toward Daniel, suspicious, defensive. As if the older man's quietness were a provocation, not a shield. A sick swallow of doubt rose inside me. Had I missed something? Some discomfort, some hesitation in Daniel I should have seen sooner? Something he didn't tell me? When I looked back toward the window, Daniel's hand was slipping into his coat pocket, slow, almost reverent. His fingers touched something beneath the fabric, something he kept hidden. A folded paper? A photograph? A keepsake he couldn't let go of? His shoulders curled inward, as though the weight of that concealed object pulled him back through years I didn't know how to imagine. He closed his eyes for a moment. A long one. I stepped closer. "Daniel," I whispered, "is everything all right?" He opened his eyes, and there was a softness there that made my heart tighten, an apology without words, a sadness without name. He withdrew his hand from his coat, letting it fall to his side, empty again. "Yes," he murmured, though the word felt like a leaf trying to hide a forest. "Just thinking." Jonah watched this exchange from across the room, mistaking Daniel's quietness for avoidance. He straightened in his chair, chin lifting in a show of confidence he didn't feel. Emily touched his hand, murmuring something, but he barely heard her. I moved back toward the table, trying to ease the distance. "Why don't we all sit together?" I offered, gently coaxing warmth into my voice. Jonah didn't respond. Emily offered me an apologetic smile. Daniel remained standing, eyes drifting once more toward my son, that same aching look flickering across his face before he forced it away again. As the servers brought plates to the tables, the low hum of conversation resumed, but it felt strained, stretched thin over something unspoken. I took my seat and looked toward Jonah, hoping to find softness in his expression, some trace of the boy who once held my hand in crowded rooms. Instead, I found distance. A wall built from misunderstanding and pride. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His gaze followed Daniel with the guardedness of someone who has already decided there is danger where there may be none. "You don't have to impress him," Emily whispered to Jonah, but he didn't answer. I felt Daniel watching, not with judgment, but with a sorrow that seemed to unravel him quietly from the inside. He looked at Jonah like someone seeing a familiar silhouette through fog, almost recognized, but painfully out of reach. Why did he look at my son like that? Like Jonah existed in a memory rather than across the room? The music shifted to something slow, something melodic, but Jonah didn't soften. Daniel didn't approach. And I sat between them, feeling like a bridge made from fragile wood. When dessert was served, Jonah finally rose to his feet. He brushed crumbs from his pants, pretending he was simply stretching his legs, but his eyes went directly to Daniel as if preparing for an invisible confrontation. Daniel stiffened. His hand moved instinctively toward his coat pocket again, fingers brushing whatever he kept inside. This time, I saw it clearly, the tremor in his hand, the tightening of his jaw, the way his breath slowed, as though steadying itself against a memory that hurt to hold. Jonah mistook the tremor for disdain. He rolled his shoulders back, crossing his arms tightly. A tension stretched between them, thin and brittle as fishing wire. I stepped forward instinctively. "Enough," I whispered under my breath, though no one had spoken. Emily's voice drifted softly behind me. "Claire, look at him. Jonah's presence does something to Daniel." I didn't need the reminder. I had seen it all evening. The way Daniel folded into himself when Jonah approached, the way his gaze softened with a kind of grief that had no place in this room. A grief too personal, too raw, too old. It struck me suddenly, a quiet, terrifying realization that felt like the floor settling beneath my feet. Daniel didn't look like a man judging my son. He looked like a man remembering something lost, something he once loved, something taken from him, something he saw now, unexpectedly, painfully, sitting across a reception hall with my son's face. As Jonah walked out onto the patio to breathe, Daniel watched him go with that same expression, longing tangled with grief. And in the soft clatter of forks and murmured conversation, one question echoed louder than anything spoken aloud. Why does my son make Daniel look like he is standing in the past, instead of in my present? The lights in the reception hall had dimmed to a soft amber glow, the kind that makes everything look warmer than it feels. Plates clinked gently, voices drifted like low waves, and yet the space between Jonah and Daniel felt sharp enough to cut through the music. I stood there, caught in the middle, watching the two men measure each other with glances that held too much unsaid. Jonah with suspicion, Daniel with a grief I still hadn't learned how to name. I drew a breath, steadying myself. Then I stepped forward and tried to stitch the room back together with something simple. Something human. "Jonah," I said softly, "have you formally met Daniel yet?" It felt like pushing two magnets that wanted nothing to do with each other. Jonah rose from his seat with a stiffness that wasn't anger. Not exactly, but something rooted deeper. Something protective. Or wounded. He extended his hand to Daniel, and Daniel took it, but the handshake barely lasted a second. Jonah's grip was firm, Daniel's gentle, almost hesitant. "Nice to meet you," Jonah said. The words were polite, but the tone slipped, a familiar edge that belonged to the little boy who once demanded answers for things he didn't understand. Daniel nodded. "And you as well, Jonah." His smile was small, careful, almost apologetic. Emily leaned against Jonah's arm, trying to soften the air with her presence alone. It wasn't enough. "So," Jonah said, brushing non-existent dust from his sleeve, "Mom tells me you've lived a quiet life." That word again. Quiet. Thinner than judgment. Thicker than dismissal. Daniel folded his hands in front of him. "I suppose so," he murmured. "Life teaches you to listen more than you speak." Jonah's eyebrow lifted. "Is that what it taught you?" I felt my breath hitch. Something in Daniel's posture shifted, subtle, but visible once you knew him. His shoulders dropped a fraction, like the comment had found a place he didn't expect. Still, he didn't defend himself. He only said, maybe in the ways that mattered. Emily cleared her throat, trying to lighten the moment. "Do you travel much, Daniel?" "No," he replied gently. "Not anymore." "Why not?" Jonah asked. There was no malice in the question, only curiosity layered with disbelief that this man, this quiet stranger, now stood in the center of my life. "I suppose," Daniel said slowly, "I was searching for something for a long time. And when I stopped searching, I didn't see the point of leaving home." Jonah frowned. "Searching for what?" A silence fell between them, thin and trembling. Daniel's eyes drifted somewhere else, somewhere far. Then he shook his head. "Just pieces of my past." Jonah's expression tightened. He didn't mean to strike a nerve, but he had. The conversation didn't loosen after that. It grew brittle, fragile, close to breaking. Jonah crossed his arms. "Mom says you don't talk much about your past." Daniel glanced at me before answering, as if asking permission to speak. "Not out of secrecy," he said quietly. "Just habit." "Convenient habit," Jonah muttered. "Jonah," I whispered, but he didn't hear me. Or maybe he didn't want to. What about childhood? Jonah asked, leaning in. Any big memories? Any regrets? Daniel froze. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way a man stills when a door he kept shut suddenly swings open. His breath shortened. His eyes dimmed. His hand drifted unconsciously toward his coat pocket, then fell away again. There are some things, Daniel said softly, that stay with you whether you want them to or not. Jonah scoffed lightly, brushing it off as cryptic. We all have regrets, Daniel. Daniel looked at him, then really looked, and something in the room shifted. The exhaustion in his gaze wasn't old age. It was grief.
Raw.
Recognizable. And Jonah, without meaning to, had stepped straight into the center of it. The band began a slow, gentle song. People laughed softly at nearby tables. But our corner of the room felt colder, quieter, suspended in something unseen. Jonah lifted his glass. Well, he said with a too-wide grin, here's to my mother's unique taste. May this marriage last longer than her last one. The table laughed politely. Emily didn't. Neither did I. Daniel's smile flickered, then faded. Jonah raised his glass higher, his voice loud enough for few nearby guests to hear. And here's to the quietest man I've ever met. Maybe someday we'll figure out what secrets he's hiding. Laughter again, sharp, scattered, uncomfortable. My hand tightened around my own glass. Jonah, that's enough. But the damage had already landed. Daniel set his glass down with a soft click. He stared at his trembling fingers, surprised by them, embarrassed by them. He curled them into a fist to stop the shake, but the tremor moved up his arm like memory had weight. His voice was barely audible. Excuse me, just for a moment. He stepped away from the table, shoulders hollow, eyes fixed on the floor like he was walking through a memory and not a room. Jonah watched him go, confusion crossing his face. Not guilt. Not yet. Just confusion. Emily whispered urgently, Jonah, what did you do? I didn't do anything, he muttered. He's just strange. Strange. That word again. But this time it landed deeper. On me. On something I knew I didn't understand. I followed Daniel toward the edge of the hall. He stood near the doorway, bracing himself against the frame as though studying a storm inside him. Daniel, I whispered. What did he stir inside you? He didn't answer at first. His breathing was slow, deliberate, practiced, the kind of breathing people do when they're holding back tears they learned long ago they had no right to shed. Finally, he spoke. I didn't expect Jonah to sound so much like someone I once knew. His voice cracked just barely. Someone I lost. The music played on, soft and indifferent. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, lights shimmered across the floor. But between us, a truth trembled that I could not name. A truth Jonah had unknowingly touched and cracked open. And as Daniel closed his eyes, his hand pressing lightly over his coat pocket, one question echoed louder than anything else. What memory inside this man was Jonah unknowingly waking back to life? The house had finally fallen quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after a long day of celebration. The lights were low, the music gone, the laughter faded into memory. Only the soft hum of the heater filled the hallways as I wandered through, still carrying the remnants of unease from the reception. That's when I saw a thin line of light beneath the study door. Faint, uncertain, as though someone inside wasn't sure they wanted to be seen. I opened it gently. Daniel sat alone at the small wooden desk, shoulders curved inward as if trying to take up less space. Before him lay a bundle of envelopes, yellowed, soft at the edges, tied together with a fading blue ribbon. He held them the way someone might hold an old wound. He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his eyes glimmered with something tired and unbearably tender. I thought everyone had gone to bed, he murmured. I was looking for you, I whispered, stepping inside. You left so suddenly. He ran his hand over the top envelope, tracing the crease, as though memorizing it once more. It wasn't Jonah, he said softly. Not really. He just brought something back. I sat across from him, the wood cold beneath my palms. Daniel, what are those? For a moment, he didn't speak. He only held the bundle a little closer to his chest, like a man deciding whether the truth would break him a second time. Then he exhaled.
Slow.
Fragile. These, he said, placing the bundle gently on the table between us, are letters. One for every birthday. Birthday? My voice felt small. Whose? A child I lost, he answered.
A boy.
The room shivered. Or maybe it was me. He untied the ribbon with shaking fingers. The envelopes fanned out. 12, maybe 13 of them, each marked in his delicate handwriting. Year 1. Year 2. Year 3. My throat tightened as memories from earlier flashed back. The way he looked at Jonah, the tremor in his hands, the quiet grief that lived in the lines around his eyes. He picked up the first letter, worn thin from time. I wrote this the night he would have turned one. I didn't know where he was. I didn't know if he was safe. But writing made me feel like I could still reach him somehow. I felt myself leaning forward, as though the truth might slip away if I didn't hold it still. Daniel, I didn't know you had a child. He nodded absently, eyes fixed on the paper. Most people don't. I stopped talking about him when talking didn't bring him back. The heater clicked softly. A car passed outside. The house seemed to listen. He opened the letter with hands too gentle for the pain it held, scanning the words he already knew by heart. I told him about the way the winter light fell through the window that day, Daniel whispered. How the air tasted of snow. How I wondered if someone held him when he cried. He paused, swallowing hard. He was taken from me, Claire. One moment he was mine, and the next he was gone. Taken? I breathed. Daniel nodded. His mother left with someone. Someone dangerous. Someone who didn't want me in the picture. I tried everything, police, private investigators, anyone who would listen. But a man with no money and no influence doesn't get far. The grief in his voice wasn't loud. It was quiet, patient, aged by time. The grief of someone who had learned how to fold heartbreak neatly so the world wouldn't see the edges. Behind us, a floorboard creaked. I turned slightly. Jonah stood in the doorway, caught between stepping forward and running back. His face was pale, eyes wide, as though he'd stumbled into a story he wasn't meant to hear. Daniel didn't see him. He reached for another envelope. This one was for his 5th birthday, he said softly. I imagined him starting school, making friends, losing teeth. I wondered if he looked like me, if he laughed like me. A tremor slipped into his voice. I kept writing, even when I stopped searching. The letters were the only thing I had left that connected us. Jonah's breath hitched, barely audible, but enough. Daniel lifted the stack, as though weighing it in his palms. By the time he would have turned 12, I stopped writing. Not because I stopped loving him, but because hope had turned into something that hurt to carry. He set the letters back down, fingertips lingering on the ribbon. I never knew what became of him. I never even knew if he was alive. Though the doorway itself carried weight. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his breath uneven, his eyes shining with something he wasn't ready to name. I closed the door gently, afraid the sound might break whatever thin thread was holding the moment together. Daniel walked to the small armchair, near the window. He didn't sit. He just rested his hand on the back of it, steadying himself. Jonah hovered near the kitchen threshold, hands shoved in his pockets to hide their trembling. Daniel, I said softly, you don't have to. I do. His voice was quiet but resolute. It's time. Jonah looked up, eyes sharp despite the tremor in his jaw. Tell me everything. Daniel nodded once, his fingers curling against the fabric of the chair. I wasn't always alone, he began. I had a wife once. And a son. He was 3, bright, stubborn, always climbing onto my shoulders. A soft, aching smile touched his lips. He used to fall asleep with his fist wrapped around my collar. Jonah's breath hitched. He quickly looked away. Daniel continued. Our marriage, it wasn't good. She was restless, always wanting more than I could give. She began taking long drives without telling me where she'd been. His voice wavered. One morning, I came home from a night shift, and the house was empty. Their clothes were gone. His toys. His blanket. He swallowed hard. She didn't even leave a note. Jonah's hands tightened in his pockets. I could see the knuckles whitening beneath the fabric. I didn't know where to start, Daniel whispered. I filed missing person reports. I searched every place she might have run to. I called her family, her friends. No one claimed to know anything. He paused, looking down at the floor. But after a while, they stopped taking my calls. Silence spread through the room like a cold draft. I followed every trail I could find, he said. For months. Then years. But she kept moving. Changing towns. Changing addresses. His voice broke softly. Some people don't want to be found. And some children get hidden so deeply, they forget the life they had before. A shiver ran through Jonah, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Daniel look up. Something happened, Jonah murmured. Something I never understood. Daniel's eyes softened. What was it? When I was little, Jonah hesitated, searching for words buried beneath years of forgetting. There's this memory. I don't know if it's real. Just flashes, really. A car driving at night. Me crying. A man running after us. He shook his head slowly. I used to wake up hearing someone calling my name. A man's voice. Daniel's breath caught, as though the room itself had taken it from him. What name? Daniel asked, barely above a whisper. Jonah closed his eyes. I don't know. I just remember the feeling of being carried, like I didn't want to let go. Daniel's hands tightened on the chair. Claire felt the world inside her shift, old memories stirring, aligning with things she'd ignored for decades. I remembered Jonah's father, the charming smile, the unpredictable disappearances, the way he'd show up with stories that never made sense. I remembered the night he returned with forged documents, new addresses, explanations that didn't match the fear in his eyes. I remembered finding Jonah in the back seat of that car, asleep and clinging to a blanket that didn't belong to us. Daniel looked between us, his face pale. When did you meet Jonah's father? He asked quietly. My throat tightened. After Jonah was already 3. 3, Daniel repeated, voice trembling. The same age. Jonah's breath quickened. Mom, I could barely speak. I didn't know, I whispered. He told me Jonah's mother died. He told me so many things. Daniel's face cracked open, grief spilling through the lines age had carved. My wife told people she was widowed. That's how she avoided suspicion. Jonah stumbled back a step, one hand braced on the table, color draining from his face. This can't be real. Daniel took a careful step toward him, not reaching, not assuming, just offering presence. The dates, Jonah muttered, voice shaking. The places, the photo on the pier. His breathing grew uneven. It all lines up. Daniel's eyes filled. I never stopped looking for him, not until I believed he must have died. Jonah pressed a hand against his forehead as though holding something in place before it collapsed. So, he could be your son, Jonah whispered. I could be your son. Daniel's lip trembled. I don't want to claim anything that isn't mine, he said softly. But everything you've told me, everything I've remembered, he swallowed. It feels like I'm standing in front of the life I lost. The room pulsed with quiet, a heartbeat held between hope and disbelief. Jonah stared at Daniel, his features shifting through confusion, fear, anger, grief. All the ghosts of a childhood he never understood. Then his voice cracked open. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because I didn't know, I whispered, tears burning behind my eyes. I swear, Jonah, I didn't know. Daniel bowed his head, shoulders trembling. I would have given anything, he said, voice raw, to watch my son grow up. Jonah exhaled a sound that was neither sob nor breath, something in between. The room felt unsteady, like the truth itself had weight. He looked at Daniel again, not with certainty, not with acceptance, but with the fragile beginning of something deeper. Do you want me to be him?
Jonah asked.
Daniel closed his eyes. One tear slipped free. I only want you, he whispered, in whatever way you choose. Outside, The wind shifted, leaves scraping softly against the window, like the world exhaling after holding something too heavy, too long. I watched Jonah's face soften, not in resolution, but in recognition. Some losses echo forever. Some returns feel like waking from a dream you never realized was yours. The sky had begun to dim, even though it was early afternoon, clouds gathering low enough to touch the tops of the trees. Jonah stepped back from us slowly, disbelief hollowing his face until it looked like something carved from shock instead of skin. His eyes moved from me to Daniel and back again, searching for a place where the world still made sense. There was none. "I can't," he whispered, voice cracking. "I can't be in this house right now." He backed away, shaking his head like the truth was something he could physically outrun. Then he turned and walked out the front door, the screen slamming behind him with a sharpness that felt like a line being drawn between us. Daniel didn't move. He didn't call after him or rise to follow. He simply lowered himself onto the porch step, elbows on his knees, hands trembling so violently he had to lace his fingers together just to keep them still. He stared at the yard as though trying to memorize every patch of grass Jonah had stepped on, every place his son had stood without knowing he was a son. His voice was barely audible. "He hates me." I knelt beside him. "He doesn't hate you. He's drowning." Daniel shook his head, eyes fixed on nothing. "I'm the reason." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that the past wasn't his fault alone, that none of us had known. But the words felt too simple for the storm swirling inside our boy. Down by the water, Jonah moved like someone carrying too much weight in his chest. His wife found him there. I saw her silhouette through the trees, small beside him, but steady. She reached for him slowly, gently. Jonah flinched, then let her touch his arm. He folded into her like a punctured thing, trying to hold himself together long enough to breathe. I couldn't hear their voices, but I could see her thumb brushing his jaw, her lips moving as she whispered something meant to anchor him. He pressed both hands to his face, shoulders heaving. Not with sobs, but with the kind of breath a person pulls from the bottom of their lungs when the world has just tilted under them. Daniel watched from the porch, heartbreak carved into the lines of his face. "He shouldn't have to comfort me," he whispered. "He shouldn't have to decide what to do, with a stranger claiming his blood." "He's not deciding about a stranger," I said softly. "He's deciding about you." Daniel's eyes filled, which might be worse. The wind swept through the yard, bending the tall grass, carrying with it the salt smell of the water. It was the same wind that used to lift Jonah's baby hair when I carried him along the shore, the same wind that once drifted through someone else's home, calling a toddler by a name he no longer remembered. After several long minutes, Jonah straightened. His wife squeezed his hand, guiding him back toward the house. Jonah moved like someone forcing himself through a storm, slow, deliberate, every step a decision. Daniel stood as Jonah approached, then stopped himself, hands curling back into trembling fists. He didn't want to make the first move. He didn't want to scare him away with hope. Jonah climbed the porch steps and stared at Daniel from only a few feet away. His chest rose and fell too quickly, his eyes glassy but determined. He looked older somehow, as if the truth had aged him years in an hour. His voice was rough when he spoke. "I have questions." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll answer anything you ask." Jonah's hands clenched. "I don't know if I want answers." Daniel's voice gentled. "I'll still give you the truth." The wind quieted, as if it too leaned closer. Jonah exhaled shakily. "Why didn't you fight harder for him?" "For you?" Daniel murmured. Jonah looked away. Daniel took a breath that shuddered at the edges. "I tried. I called every police station, every shelter, every relative. I drove through towns I'd never heard of, searching faces that weren't yours." His voice thinned. "But your mother kept running. And after years of chasing shadows, I became afraid that maybe I wasn't supposed to find you." Jonah's throat worked, but he didn't speak. "You don't owe me anything," Daniel added softly. "Not forgiveness. Not recognition. Not a place in your life. But you deserve to know the truth of where you came from. You deserve to know that you were loved, even when you were lost." Jonah flinched, as if the word struck him. His wife touched the small of his back, grounding him. Jonah's next question came out in a whisper. Why me? Why now? Daniel lifted his eyes, gentle, weathered, holding the weight of decades. Because when I met your mother, I recognized your smile. A tremor broke through his voice. And when I saw that photograph of you on her mantel, standing on the pier where I searched for you, I knew, not with certainty, but with the ache I've carried all my life. Jonah looked at me then, and something inside him broke open.
Did you know? He asked.
No, I whispered. I swear I didn't know. Jonah's face softened, but only slightly. He turned back to Daniel. Do you want me, he said slowly, because I might be your son? Or because you see me as him? Daniel stepped closer, barely a breath between them. I want you, he whispered, because I never stopped loving the boy who vanished, and because you walk like him, breathe like him, and look at the world the way he did. But I will learn who you are now, not who I lost then. Silence fell, thick, trembling, sacred. Then Jonah nodded once, very small. Okay, he said, voice cracking. Then start answering everything. He wasn't forgiving. He wasn't accepting.
But he was choosing to stay.
Daniel exhaled, a sound almost like prayer. And as Jonah sank onto the porch step, Daniel sat beside him without touching, giving him space but not letting him fall alone. It wasn't healing.
Not yet.
But it was the first breath of it, the moment when truth stops drowning and begins to float. And I stood in the doorway, watching my son and the man who might be his father share a silence that felt like a bridge finally being built. I remember the way the room shifted when Daniel returned from the porch. The air had been tight, stretched thin by Jonah's questions and the truth we could no longer outrun. But Daniel stepped in quietly, like someone carrying something fragile enough to break the moment it met the wrong kind of silence. He held a bundle wrapped in ribbon. Old ribbon, the kind that frays at the edges because hands have touched it too often. The kind tied not for decoration, but for holding something together.
He didn't speak.
He just sat down at the table, placed the bundle before him, and untied the bow with fingers that shook more than I'd ever seen. Jonah watched him, guarded, breath shallow. His wife stood behind him, a hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the way only she could. Daniel unfolded the top envelope. Yellowed, soft, tired from years of being opened and closed. He slid it across the table. For his 3rd birthday, he murmured.
Jonah stared at it.
Not reaching, not refusing, just staring. The house held its breath. When he finally touched the letter, his thumb brushed the faded corner, and I saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of recognition he didn't want, but couldn't deny. He unfolded it slowly, the paper crackling like winter leaves. Daniel's handwriting filled the page, looped, neat, careful in the way of someone who believes words are all they have left. Today you would have been 3. I don't know if you like trains or horses. I don't know if you still carry your blanket everywhere. I don't know your favorite color. But I hope the world is kind to you. I hope you're warm tonight. I hope you're alive. Jonah read in silence. No one moved. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft thud of Jonah's heartbeat pulsing in the hollow of his throat. Daniel placed another envelope on the table. 4. Another. 5. Another. 6. Dozens of them, layered like years stacked one atop the other. Each one a year Daniel spent searching. Each one a year Jonah spent lost. Jonah swallowed hard. I watched his fingers tremble against the paper, the same hands I held when he was small and frightened, the same hands Jonah's father once gripped too tightly while running with lies instead of love. He read another letter. Your mother left before dawn. I followed for miles, but the road swallowed her whole. If you ever wonder whether you were wanted, the answer is yes. More than breath. I hope you will forgive me for not finding you in time. Jonah's breath hitched. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes, trying to hide how much it hurt. Daniel kept his gaze lowered, as though he had no right to witness the effect his words were having. He looked smaller somehow, not frail, but stripped down to the hollow ache that shaped him. The man Jonah mocked at the wedding. The man he assumed was fragile, irrelevant, unimportant. That man had written a lifetime of letters to a child who never knew him. A child who sat feet away now, trying not to break open. I watched Jonah read, page after page, each word unraveling him in quiet threads. He wasn't angry anymore.